Welcome back. I've been going through a particular script this week, and there is one move in it I keep returning to. A woman walks into a family court and hands her ex-husband full custody of their children. No contest, no tears. The deliberateness of that concession is the entire weapon. You're watching Historical Manhwa. The first thing she noticed was the smell of antiseptic. Not the distant, clinical kind that hospitals tried to mask with lavender diffusers and plastic plants. This was the real thing. Raw, biting, settling into the lining of the throat like cold copper. She was lying on something firm and narrow. Her left arm ached where the IV needle had been. A monitor beeped at intervals that seemed almost indifferent to whether she lived or died. Vivian Shen opened her eyes. The ceiling was not the one she had last looked at. The last ceiling she remembered was a penthouse ceiling in her former life. 18 feet of coffered plaster in the Langford family apartment, the one Carter had transferred into a shell company 3 months before he served her with divorce papers. She had stared at that ceiling the night she understood everything, the night she calculated the full extent of what had been done to her, the night her heart finally stopped after what the paramedics later described as an acute myocardial infarction brought on by prolonged emotional and physiological stress. She had been 41. Her daughters and son had been taken from her. Her accounts had been emptied through a series of legal instruments she hadn't known to watch for. She had died on a Tuesday in October, on the floor of a borrowed apartment, with the sound of the city pressing through a cracked window. That was the ceiling she remembered. This ceiling was water-stained tile, and the date on the dry erase board bolted to the wall across from her bed read March 14th. A year she recognized immediately, because she had lived through it once before and had spent the second half of it begging a family court judge not to separate her from her children. Her body was 33 again. She lay still for 4 minutes. Not from shock, from calculation. There was a specific kind of silence that followed a rebirth. She had no other word for it, though she had never believed in such things when she was first alive. The silence wasn't spiritual, it was operational. Every memory from the first life was present, complete, and indexed, as if her mind had spent whatever gap existed between death and this moment filing and cross-referencing. She could recall, with the precision of someone who had read the documents 100 times because she had read the documents 100 times, the exact language of Carter Langford's petition for sole legal and physical custody. She could recall her own attorney's face when she'd learned that 3 of the 4 financial accounts she believed were joint had been quietly restructured into Carter's sole ownership over the preceding 2 years. She could recall her daughter Mia's voice on the courthouse steps, 9 years old in that life, wearing a yellow coat, asking why Mama wasn't coming home with them. She recalled that sound, the way you recall the specific pitch of a smoke alarm. It did not make her cry. It made something in the center of her chest go very quiet and very cold. A nurse came in to check the monitor. Young woman, professional. She said something about vitals and fluid intake and asked if Vivian remembered what had happened. "I fainted," Vivian said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. At the office. "Your husband is in the waiting room," the nurse offered. "He's been here since they brought you in." Husband. Carter Langford was still her husband in this life. She was 33, and it was March, and they had not yet begun the formal dissolution proceedings. They had not yet entered the phase she privately termed the stripping period, that 18-month window during which Carter, with the help of his family's attorneys at Greystone and Mercer LLP, had systematically removed her name from every asset, every account, every holding she had believed was theirs. The divorce petition would come in 7 months. She had 7 months. "Tell him I'm resting," she said. The nurse nodded and left. Vivian turned her face toward the water-stained ceiling and began, in absolute silence, to work. The thing about Carter Langford was that he was not a cartoon villain. She had made that mistake in her first life, spending too many months trying to understand him, finding corners of his behavior that seemed human enough to explain away, constructing interpretations that allowed her to believe the marriage was salvageable even as he was dismantling it piece by piece beneath the floorboards of their shared life. He had the face of someone trustworthy. Even now, knowing everything, she could acknowledge it without sentimentality. Dark eyes, measured voice, the particular kind of stillness that certain people mistake for depth. He had grown up in money, which meant he had grown up learning to let other people speak first and then to wait for the moment when their words revealed something useful. He had used that skill on her from the beginning. They had met when she was 26 and working as a junior analyst at Harmon Capital. He had come in for a meeting with her managing director, and she had been the one to walk him through the preliminary report. He had asked 3 questions, all precise, all designed to demonstrate that he already understood more than the room gave him credit for. After the meeting, he had waited for her in the lobby. She had not been charmed by that. She had been charmed, she now understood, by the fact that he listened to her in a way no one in her professional life had yet bothered to do. He had looked at her as if the specific things she was saying mattered, not just the general impression she made. She had been 26 and good at her work, and quietly lonely, in the particular way that competent women in male-dominant industries often are. He had walked through that door at precisely the right time. That was the first instrument he had used on her. Timing. The second was patience. Carter never moved quickly. In the first years of the marriage, she had admired this, the way he let things develop, the way he never appeared reactive. She had interpreted it as wisdom. She now understood it as the natural pace of someone who had been planning long enough that urgency was never necessary. He had started restructuring their finances in the 3rd year of the marriage. Not all at once. One account, then another. Transfers that made operational sense at the time, framed as tax efficiency, framed as portfolio consolidation. She had signed documents she had not read thoroughly enough because she trusted him and because he had never once given her a reason, a single concrete reason, to stop trusting him. He had given her children in that time, Mia, who was 2 years old in the current March, Leo, who was 4 months old and sleeping in a bassinet in the nursery of their apartment on Callaway Street. The 3rd child, a boy they had named James, she had lost at 6 months in her first life, a grief that had hollowed her out during a period when Carter had already begun the quiet architecture of their financial separation, so that she had been too undone to notice. In this life, James did not yet exist. He would be conceived in August, if the timeline held. She would need to make decisions about that. But first, the money. She was discharged on the following afternoon. Carter came to collect her. He held her hand in the elevator and asked the doctor quiet, measured questions about her recovery. He had brought the car around himself, which he rarely did, because he understood optics. He had understood since the very beginning that appearing attentive cost him nothing and purchased considerable goodwill. From her family, from the social world they occupied together. In the car, he put her hand on his knee and kept one palm on it while he drove, and she sat beside him and looked out the window at the gray March city and allowed herself to feel none of it. She had spent the night in the hospital organizing memory into sequence. Dates, figures, document titles, names of attorneys, names of notaries, specific language from the family court rulings. She had been a financial analyst before she married Carter and had spent the intervening years as the primary manager of their household and their children's lives, what her first life attorney had called, with visible frustration, a significant career gap. She would not have that career gap in this life. She would not be the woman who had trusted and then been caught without armor when the trust proved unfounded. She needed 3 things before the divorce petition arrived in October. She needed documentation of her financial contributions to the marriage. She needed a professional re-entry that established independent income. And she needed something specific that she had only understood after reading every CPS report, every family court transcript, every child welfare evaluation from her first life with the obsessive clarity of someone who had already lost. She needed Carter to have the children. This was the move that had seemed impossible the first time. The move that, even now, required her to hold very still against the part of herself that would burn the entire architecture down before it allowed her children to be used as instruments. But she had thought about it for an entire night, with an IV in her arm and a monitor beeping at careful intervals. And she understood it the way she understood compound interest, or the difference between a revocable and an irrevocable trust. The logic was not emotional. It was structural. In her first life, she had fought for custody with everything she had. She had fought so hard and so publicly that Carter's attorneys had used her emotional volatility as evidence of instability. She had spent money she didn't have on a legal battle that lasted 14 months. She had lost, not completely, she had gotten alternating weekends and one evening a week, but she had lost the primary placement she needed, and in the process, she had spent herself down to nothing and given Carter's team exactly the portrait of her they wanted. A woman unraveling. A woman who had nothing but her children and was therefore dangerous in her desperation. She had never understood, in that life, that the desperation itself was the problem. She understood it now. Carter was not equipped to raise children. She had known this in an emotional way during their marriage. She had been the one who scheduled every pediatric appointment, who remembered every allergy, who knew which of Mia's friends she preferred and which ones made her quiet in a way that meant something was wrong. She had known it the way women in marriages like hers often know things, thoroughly, without anyone requiring her to say it aloud. But she had never known it in the legal, documented, child welfare statute-specific way that made it actionable. She knew it that way now. She had spent the nights following her discharge from the hospital reading, not new material, old material reconstructed from memory, family code statutes, CPS mandatory reporting guidelines for the state, the specific language of what constituted a substantiated finding in a child welfare investigation, the threshold for emergency protective custody, the 3-report protocol that several counties used as a trigger point for an emergency removal hearing. She knew, because she had lived through it in the most painful iteration possible, that Carter Langford could not manage 2 children for 6 months without creating at least 2 documented incidents of neglect. Not because he was monstrous, because he was a man who had never once in his adult life been the person responsible for a child's immediate physical safety, and believed, with the specific confidence of someone who had always had domestic staff, that such responsibility was fundamentally manageable by other people. He had believed this during their marriage. He would believe it after. And when the domestic staff he hired turned out to be imperfect, when the arrangement he had designed as a demonstration of winning turned out to require actual daily labor, he would begin to cut corners. He always cut corners when something bored him. And children, she knew with precise clarity, bored Carter Langford. He had wanted them the way he had wanted everything, as additions to a specific vision of his life. Children in a family portrait, children at a holiday dinner, children in an apartment that spoke of establishment and taste. The actual children, the ones who needed to be picked up from school at 3:15 regardless of what was happening at the office, the ones who woke at 2 in the morning with fevers, the ones who required meals that were neither whatever was in the refrigerator nor delivery from a restaurant with no children's menu. Those children had never fully fit the vision. He had tolerated the gap in the marriage because she had been there to fill it. He would not tolerate it alone. She had 31 weeks before the divorce petition was filed. She used them. The first person she called, 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, was her college roommate, Diane Shue, who had become a family law attorney in the intervening decade and who had, in Vivian's first life, been brought in too late and too underfunded to alter the outcome. Vivian called her on a Wednesday afternoon while Carter was at a client lunch and Mia was at preschool and Leo was asleep in the nursery. She called from the small desk in what she had always privately called the reading room, a narrow, underlit space off the main hallway that Carter never entered because it contained nothing of interest to him. "I need to talk to you," she told Diane, not as a friend, as an attorney. There was a pause. Diane had been her friend for 11 years. She had the capacity to read the texture of Vivian's voice the way a sommelier reads a vintage, not just what was present, but what the absence of certain things meant. "When?" she said. "As soon as possible. And I need this to be a privileged conversation from the beginning. I need to know that what I tell you doesn't leave the room." Another pause. Shorter. "I'll clear Thursday afternoon." Vivian sat across from Diane at a small conference table in her Midtown office 2 days later, and she told her everything. Not the rebirth. There was no language for that, and she had decided, with practical efficiency, that the supernatural architecture of her situation was irrelevant to its legal execution. She told her everything that was relevant. The financial restructuring she suspected was already underway, The accounts she had noticed had gone quiet. The limited liability entities she had identified through their tax filings that she believed were being used to shield marital assets. She told her what she knew about Carter's behavior around the children. She told her what she wanted. Diane listened with the particular stillness of a very good attorney in the presence of a client who has already done significant analysis. She asked precise questions. She took notes in a way that suggested she was already organizing the information into case architecture. When Vivian finished, Diane set down her pen and said, "You want to concede custody? Full legal and physical. Vivian, I need you to understand that this is a strategic decision, not an emotional one. It's going to look like an emotional one to the court, to everyone, which is what makes it effective." Diane was quiet for a moment. She had the face of someone who was running multiple concurrent considerations and allowing each of them to resolve before she spoke. "You understand that once you sign over full legal and physical custody, your rights don't disappear entirely, but your ability to make decisions for the children is severely curtailed. Medical decisions, educational decisions. You're handing him those levers." "I know, and you're trusting that he misuses them." "I'm not trusting anything," Vivian said. "I'm accounting for probability." She watched Diane process this. The attorney's eyes moved to her notepad. Back to Vivian. She had the particular quality of a person rearranging their understanding of a situation without allowing the rearrangement to show on her face. "What are you basing that probability on?" "Specific instances," Vivian said. "Documented behavioral patterns. His reliance on domestic staff, the way he structures his schedule around social and professional obligations without carving out time that could be described as reserved for the children. His drinking habits. The fact that he has never, in the time I've known him, filled out a school form, attended a pediatric appointment alone, or responded to a child's illness without my physical presence in the household." Diane wrote something down. "His drinking habits," she said. "Is this social drinking or 3 to 5 drinks per evening when he's home? More on weekends. He functions. He doesn't impair himself to the point of obvious disability, which is what makes it legally invisible during a marriage. But alone with 2 children under 5 at 2 in the morning, when someone is sick, the margin for error is different. Is this something you can document?" "I've been documenting it for 2 weeks," Vivian said. "Dates, times, quantities. I intend to continue through the filing." "That's going to be challenged as self-serving." "Every piece of evidence in a custody case is self-serving. The question is whether it's corroborated." She looked at Diane steadily. "There are other people who have observed this. His behavior at social events is not contained to our home. I've been compiling a list." Diane looked at her for a moment that stretched slightly longer than a professional exchange typically warranted. "You've changed," she said finally. "Not an accusation, an observation. The kind that required a response that was neither explanation nor apology." "I've been thinking very clearly," Vivian said. The strategy, as she had constructed it in the hospital and refined it in the weeks that followed, was built on 3 pillars. The first pillar was the concession itself. By refusing to fight for custody, she would accomplish 2 things simultaneously. She would remove herself as the target of Carter's legal team's primary strategy, which she knew was built around portraying her as emotionally unstable and professionally irrelevant. And she would allow Carter to experience the full, unmediated weight of primary parenthood without a safety net. He had spent considerable effort constructing a legal argument that she was an inadequate primary caregiver. If she stepped aside and handed him the role, he would have to perform it. He would have to perform it consistently, daily, without the domestic architecture she had maintained, or the staff she had managed, or the invisible labor she had provided. He would be required, by the very victory he had engineered, to do what she had been doing alone for years. The second pillar was documentation before the filing. She spent the 7 months before Carter's attorneys delivered the divorce petition building a parallel record. Not of her suffering. She had no interest in evidence of her suffering. She built a record of their children's needs. Mia's medical history, detailed and organized, every appointment, every developmental note, every teacher observation from her preschool. Leo's feeding schedule, his sleep patterns, the specific list of things that soothed him when he was distressed, which she typed into a document she would give to whatever attorney would eventually represent the children's interests. She built a record that established, in the most neutral language possible, exactly how much operational knowledge was required to maintain the welfare of 2 children under 5. She also built a record of everything she was afraid would be missing when Carter took over. The name of the pediatrician who knew Mia's tendency toward febrile seizures. The school protocol for Leo's mild dairy sensitivity. The specific sound Mia made in her sleep when she was beginning a fever. A thin and slightly elevated breathing pattern that was easy to miss if you weren't listening for it. She put all of this in a document she titled Children's Welfare Reference Guide. She made copies. She gave one to her mother. She gave one to Diane. She kept the original on a server she controlled. It was not a legal document. It was a timestamp. Evidence of what she had known and what Carter had never been required to learn. The third pillar was the network. This was the one she had not understood in her first life. She had thought then that the relevant players were the attorneys and the judge. She had not understood that the ecosystem surrounding a custody arrangement, the school, the pediatrician, the neighbors, the domestic staff Carter would eventually hire, was itself a system of mandatory reporters and welfare monitors that, if properly primed, would do the work she could not do herself. She did not lie to these people. She did not manipulate them in a way she would not have been able to describe clearly and without shame in a courtroom. She did what any responsible parent does when transitioning children to a new primary household. She made introductions. She sat down with Mia's preschool director and discussed, calmly and in specific terms, the things they should know about Mia's emotional landscape as her family situation changed. She met with their pediatrician, Dr. Anand, and updated the file on both children with a level of detail and care that the doctor noted in the chart as thorough. She told the pediatrician that Carter would be the primary parent going forward and provided his contact information and asked, naturally as she could manage, that the office note any missed appointments or gaps in care. She did none of this dramatically. She did not present herself as a woman anticipating disaster. She presented herself as a woman managing a transition with care. Because that, functionally, was what she was. She also called, once, a woman named Rosario Quintero, who had worked as a housekeeper for the Langford family for 11 years before retiring. Vivian had always liked Rosario. In her first life, Rosario had come to her 2 years into the custody arrangement and told her things about Carter's household management that had made Vivian's stomach drop. But by then, the legal clock had already been running against her. In this life, she called Rosario simply to maintain the relationship, to ask about her daughter, to tell her, warmly and without agenda on the surface of the call, that she was grateful for the years she had worked for them. She did not ask Rosario for anything. Rosario was exactly the kind of person who paid attention to children's welfare without needing to be asked. The divorce petition arrived on an October morning. Carter's attorneys delivered it by process server, which told her something about how Carter was framing this, not as a mutual uncoupling, but as a legal action taken against a party. She read through it sitting at the small desk in the reading room while Leo napped and Mia was in school. The petition sought sole legal and physical custody on the grounds of her diminished capacity for primary caregiving, language that made her appreciate the precision of the attorneys at Greystone and Mercer LLP. They had used nothing inflammatory, just that phrase, clinical and damning, designed to let the judge fill in her own image of what a woman with diminished capacity looked like. She did not experience rage. She experienced something more like the specific satisfaction of a person who has been waiting for an event, and who, when the event arrives, has been so thoroughly prepared for it that surprise has been replaced by sequence. She called Diane. "It's here," she said. "I know. I heard from opposing counsel this morning." Diane's voice was careful. "Are you ready to discuss response strategy?" "We're not going to contest custody," Vivian said. "We discussed this. We discussed a framework. I want to make sure that framework still holds given the language they've used." "The language is precisely why it holds," Vivian said. "They've committed themselves to a position. If we fight it, we play on their terrain. If we don't, we hand Carter the custody arrangement he's argued for in his petition, and now he has to live inside it." There was a silence on the line that she recognized as Diane suppressing her instinct to argue. "The visitation terms. Liberal and specific," Vivian said. "I want specificity, not general reasonable visitation. I want dates, times, contingencies. I want it written in a way that if he deviates from the schedule, there's a clear record. His team is going to push for minimal visitation for you. Let them. I want the minimum to be generous enough that I maintain a meaningful presence in the children's lives. 2 weekends a month, Wednesday evenings, all school holidays. That's the floor I won't go below." He'll agree to that because he thinks it proves his case. He'll agree to that because he doesn't understand what it means for me to have maintained an active presence in the children's lives when CPS starts asking where the primary caregiver has been. She said it quietly. It was not a threat for Diane's ears. It was a structural note, the kind you make when you're reading blueprints. "Vivian," Diane said, in a tone that was not quite a warning and not quite concern. "What are you expecting to happen?" "I'm expecting Carter to be Carter," she said, "which means I'm expecting the children to need someone to call." The court date was in January. The hearing was, as she had designed it to be, brief. Carter's attorneys presented their petition. Diane presented Vivian's non-contested response, inclusive of the proposed visitation schedule, which Carter's team accepted with the specific satisfaction of people who believe they have received more than they negotiated for. The judge reviewed the terms, asked Vivian directly whether she understood what she was agreeing to, and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was professional, but not entirely without something softer underneath it. A judge who had been on the family court bench long enough to recognize when the person sitting across from her was holding something back. "Ms. Shen," the judge said, "full legal and physical custody is a significant arrangement. You've had independent counsel review these terms?" "I have," Vivian said. Her voice was clear. Her posture was the posture of someone who had decided, deliberately, and from a position of knowledge rather than defeat. "And you're not making this decision under duress?" "I'm making this decision with complete clarity about what I want for my children." The judge looked at her for a moment longer. Then she initialed the terms. The gavel came down with a sound that Vivian experienced not as a door closing, but as a starting gun. Carter was gracious in the elevator afterward. He always was, in moments of public victory. He said something about hoping they could make this work for the children's sake, which was the kind of thing he said in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. His attorney, a broad-shouldered man named Prescott, who wore cufflinks she recognized from their social circuit, shook Vivian's hand with the specific warmth of someone who had never considered her a serious opponent. "Best outcome for everyone," Prescott said. "Yes," she agreed, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with what he thought she meant. She moved into the apartment she had spent 2 months quietly securing. Not a borrowed one this time, not a place that reflected reduced circumstances. She had re-entered the workforce in the months before the divorce filing, leveraging her financial analysis background to take a consultancy role with a boutique firm, and she had structured her income in a way that appeared modest in the court filings, but was actually the beginning of a careful rebuild. She had a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side with good light, and a bedroom she had furnished for the children with the specific care of someone who intended for that bedroom to be used. She gave Carter the primary arrangement and did not cry about it. She had done her crying in the hospital in March, alone, at 2 a.m. for exactly 1 hour. She had allowed herself that hour. 1 hour for everything she had lost the first time and everything she was accepting the second time as the price of a different kind of winning. Then she had breathed in the antiseptic air and organized her thoughts and moved forward. The first 30 days of the custody arrangement were deceptively smooth. Carter had hired a live-in nanny, a young woman named Paige, whose references were solid and whose manner with the children was, by all accounts, appropriate. Vivian observed this during her Wednesday evening visits and her first weekend. Paige was competent. She was also, as Vivian had known she would be, the first vulnerability in Carter's arrangement, because Carter related to domestic staff the way he related to subscription services. Useful until they weren't, replaceable without particular care. On her Wednesday visits, Vivian watched the children with the focused, quiet attention of someone taking an inventory. Mia, who was now 3, was a sharp-eyed child who had inherited neither Vivian's reserve nor Carter's calculation, but something of her own. An emotional precision, a capacity for observation that manifested as a habit of watching adults for inconsistency between their words and their behavior. She had, even at 3, a particular expression she deployed when something didn't add up. Vivian noticed that this expression appeared on Mia's face frequently during the Wednesday visits, at moments when Paige said something that slightly contradicted what had apparently happened that day. She did not interrogate Mia. She listened. She asked the open-ended, developmental questions that a parent asks a young child. What did you do today? What did you eat? What was the best part? And noted the content of the answers without reaction. She asked about Paige in the same tone she asked about Mia's friends at preschool. She kept a private log on her phone, time-stamped, noting the specific things Mia said and the specific behaviors she observed in both children. Leo was 14 months old during this period. He was a quiet, attentive baby who had been, in Vivian's household, routinely put to bed between 7:30 and 8 with a specific sleep routine that she had outlined in the Children's Welfare Reference Guide she had provided to the court and to both households as part of the divorce proceedings. She noticed, at her first weekend pickup, that Leo had circles under his eyes that suggested disrupted sleep, and that he was clingier than usual during the handoff. Not the ordinary transitional clinginess of a child moving between households, but the sustained, high-alert attachment of a child who had not been sleeping or eating on a predictable schedule. She noted this. She said nothing to anyone at that point. She filed it. In month 2, Carter dismissed Paige. She knew this because Mia told her on a Wednesday evening that the nice lady went away. She also knew it because the pickup she did on the following Friday showed her an apartment that was impeccably maintained on the surface and subtly disordered beneath. The kind of entropy that happens when someone who doesn't know how to run a household has spent several days trying to perform the task without assistance. The refrigerator, which she could see from the kitchen doorway, contained a significant amount of takeout packaging and very little of the specific foods she had listed in the Children's Welfare Reference Guide as part of Mia's and Leo's daily nutritional needs. Mia's favorite stuffed rabbit, which was essential to her bedtime routine and had been included in the list of items to transfer with the children, was missing from the apartment. When Vivian asked where it was, Carter said he thought it was at the preschool. He said this with the specific confidence of someone who is operating on a guess. The rabbit was not at the preschool. She bought Mia a replacement rabbit that weekend and brought it back at Sunday drop-off. She said nothing about it. She included a note in her parenting log. March 8th, children's primary comfort item missing from primary residence, primary caregiver unable to locate, purchased replacement. Carter hired a new nanny within the week, a woman named Carla, whose manner was efficient, but whose interaction with the children, particularly Leo, had a slightly mechanical quality that Vivian registered without judgment. Carla was competent in the way that someone newly placed in a household is competent. She was following explicit instructions, but had not yet developed the fine-grained attunement that comes from sustained relationship with specific children. Month 3 was when the first incident occurred. She did not know the details until after the fact. She was told by Mia during a Wednesday pickup that Daddy's friend was loud and Leo cried a lot and I hid in my room. The sequencing of this information, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of a 3-year-old who has decided to report an event without fully understanding its significance, arrived while Vivian was buckling Mia into the car seat. She finished the buckle before she responded. Her voice was level. "When was that, sweetheart?" "Last night," Mia considered. "And the night before." "Did Carla help?" A small pause. "Carla goes home," Mia said, "at bedtime." So Carla was not, in fact, live-in. The arrangement Carter had described as a live-in nanny was a nanny with extended hours who went home at 8 o'clock, which meant that whatever was happening with Daddy's friend and a distressed infant was happening without any childcare presence in the household. She asked, in the tone of a curious parent and not a recording device, "Does Daddy's friend come over a lot?" A small hum. Mia appeared to be thinking about the rabbit she was holding rather than the question. "She's loud, and she wears a lot of smell." She filed this entry in the log when she got home. Then she called Diane. "Not yet," Diane said when she understood what Vivian was presenting. One incident reported secondhand by a 3-year-old isn't going to trigger anything useful. We need either a direct observation or a report from a mandatory reporter. I know, Vivian said. I'm not calling to act. I'm calling to document the conversation. A silence. Then, understood. Month 3 also produced the preschool incident. Mia was late for pickup 3 times in a 4-week period. The school had a policy of contacting the emergency secondary contact after 30 minutes, which was Vivian, and she had taken the calls, driven to the school, retrieved Mia, and logged each occurrence. On the 3rd call, the school director, a measured woman named Mrs. Hargreaves, had spoken to Vivian with the careful tone of someone who was not quite asking a question, but was extending an opening. "We've been seeing a bit of inconsistency in the mornings, too," she said. "Lunch is coming in with items she shouldn't have." A reference to Mia's mild allergy. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page." Vivian thanked her and asked if the school had a process for flagging welfare concerns. Mrs. Hargreaves said they did, and that they were also mandatory reporters, and that the flag was informal at this point, but that they were monitoring. Vivian thanked her again. She drove home with Mia in the back seat, and Mia's small hand wrapped around Vivian's finger through the gap between the front seats. She noted the conversation in her log, with the date and time and the name of the person who had spoken to her and the exact phrases used. She noted it in the same flat, time-stamped language she had used for everything else. Because the language of the log was not for her. It was for the caseworker who would eventually read it, and for the guardian ad litem who would be appointed to represent the children's interests, and for the judge who would need to understand that the pattern she was describing had not been constructed after the fact, but had been recorded in real time, entry by entry, by a parent who had been paying attention every single day. In month 4, Carla quit. Carter did not tell Vivian directly. She learned it from the school, which called her on a Tuesday because Mia had not been picked up and Carter was not answering his phone. She drove to the school in 22 minutes. Mia was sitting in the school director's office with a juice box and a blanket that belonged to the school's nurse station, and her expression when she saw Vivian was one that Vivian would not allow herself to fully absorb in the moment because she needed to function. She filed a report with the school that day. Not an accusation. An observation. The child had been left at school without contact from the primary caregiver. The emergency contact had been required to retrieve the child. The primary caregiver had not answered his phone during the incident. She asked the school to document the incident in Mia's file. Ms. Hargreaves did so. She also, though she did not tell Vivian this immediately, made a call to the State Family Services line. That was the first CPS referral. An investigation was opened. A caseworker came to Carter's apartment and conducted an interview. Carter was present, with a new nanny he had hired in the preceding 3 days, and the apartment was, as it always was when Carter knew someone was watching, impeccably maintained. The investigator noted the children appeared healthy and that the primary caregiver had responded appropriately to the referral. The case was recorded as unsubstantiated. This was expected. First referrals rarely produced substantiated findings. The significance of the first referral was not the outcome. The significance was the opening of the file. She said nothing to Carter about the investigation. She waited. Carter's girlfriend in month 4 was a woman named Jasmine Haley, who was 27 and worked in brand management and had, as far as Vivian could determine, approximately 0 experience with young children. She had met Jasmine briefly at a handoff in month 3. Tall, striking, wearing something that smelled, even from 10 feet away, of a very distinctive perfume that she was fairly certain Mia had been describing as a lot of smell. She had noted Jasmine in her log without judgment. Jasmine's behavior in a relationship with Carter was not Vivian's concern. Jasmine's behavior in a household with Mia and Leo was. In month 5, the police were called to the Callaway Street apartment. She did not know this immediately. She learned it because Rosario Quintero, who lived 4 blocks from the building and who had, in the month since the divorce, maintained what could be described as a grandmotherly relationship with the doorman, mentioned it in a phone call. Just mentioned it. The way you mention a thing you've heard because you thought the other person would want to know. Vivian listened to Rosario describe what she had heard, thanked her, and sat for a moment with the phone face down on the kitchen table. She picked it up and called Diane. "Domestic disturbance call to the primary custody household," Diane said, slowly. "If the children were present," they were. It was 11:30 on a Saturday night. The police report will be public record. If it names the address and notes the presence of minors, it does. Rosario confirmed the children were mentioned in the officer's notes. Another pause. Diane's voice shifted slightly into what Vivian privately called her structural mode, the tone she used when she was moving from analysis to action. This is a second referral trigger. If we submit a copy of the police report with a formal welfare inquiry to family services, we don't submit anything, Vivian said. We wait for the mandatory reporters who are already watching to submit it. Vivian, that could take. Mrs. Hargreaves has already called family services once. She reads the public police logs for the district. I know this because she mentioned it once, in passing, when she was explaining how the school tracks neighborhood safety for after-school activities. She paused. She will see the report. She will make the connection. She will call. Diane was quiet for a moment. And if she doesn't? Then we use the police report ourselves. But I want the second referral to come from someone other than me. I want it to come from a mandatory reporter with no stake in the custody arrangement. Because if it comes from you, Carter's attorneys claim harassment. Because if it comes from a mandatory reporter, it can't be dismissed as a tactical move in a custody dispute. It has to be investigated on its own terms. This was the part of the strategy that had taken her the longest to construct, the part that required her to understand mandatory reporting law not as an abstract category, but as a functioning system with its own protocols and pressures and institutional incentives. In most jurisdictions, mandatory reporters, teachers, physicians, social workers, certain childcare providers were legally obligated to contact family services when they had reasonable cause to suspect that a child was experiencing abuse or neglect. The obligation was not discretionary. It was not contingent on certainty. Reasonable cause to suspect was the statutory threshold, and reasonable cause was, in practice, a considerably lower bar than the kind of evidence that would be required in a courtroom. A pattern of late pickups, lunches arriving with allergens, a police call logged at an address with minor children noted in the file. These were individually minor. Together, to the trained eye of a mandatory reporter who had been watching a specific household for 4 months, they constituted exactly the kind of accumulation that the system was designed to respond to. She had not manufactured any of it. She had simply ensured, through her network of introductions and her meticulous documentation and her careful professional presence in every interaction connected to the children's welfare, that the people who were positioned to see what was happening were looking. Mrs. Hargreaves made the call 4 days after the police report was filed. The second investigation was more involved. The caseworker was different. A veteran of the county office named Mr. Delian, who had been doing this long enough to read a household the way a doctor reads a chart. He came twice. He interviewed Carter. He interviewed the new nanny Carter had retained, a woman whose name Vivian didn't know, but who, based on what Mia told her during their Luisiera Wednesday visit, had already expressed to Carter that the job was not what she had expected. Mr. DeLeon made a home visit on a day when Vivian happened to have Mia for a Wednesday evening, and could therefore tell Mr. DeLeon, when he called to schedule the comparative home visit for Vivian's residence, that her apartment was available any time that week. The comparative home visit took 40 minutes. Mr. DeLeon was professional and largely silent, but he was the kind of person whose silence was itself communicative. He walked through the children's bedroom, which Vivian had maintained with the same precision she maintained everything she intended to be seen, and he noted the organized books and the labeled cubbies and the list of emergency contacts posted inside the cabinet above the bathroom sink. He noted the refrigerator content. He noted the first aid kit and the allergy medication and the 2-page document clipped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet that listed both children's medical histories, current medications, and the name and direct line of their pediatrician. He noted, without saying anything, the framed photograph on the children's nightstand. Mia and Leo in a park on a sunny day, both of them in motion. Mia mid-laugh, Leo reaching for something outside the frame, the kind of photograph that exists because someone was present and watching closely enough to capture the moment. Before he left, Mr. DeLeon asked her one question that was not on the standard welfare checklist. How often do you speak to your children's pediatrician? At least once a month, she said. More if there's a health concern. Dr. Anand has the children's full history, and I make sure he has current contact information for both households." She paused. "I believe he's noted some missed appointments on Mr. Langford's side. I flagged it to his office when it came to my attention." Mr. De Leon nodded and wrote something down and thanked her for her time. The second referral was substantiated. A substantiated finding triggered a formal case opening. Carter was required to participate in a family services interview. He was, according to what Diane's contact at the county office reported, measured and reasonable in the interview and successfully framed the incidents as the temporary disruptions of a household in transition. He was not, in the family services system's terminology, an imminent danger to his children. He was a primary caregiver experiencing adjustment challenges. They required him to complete a parenting support class. They required documentation of stable childcare. They scheduled a follow-up home visit. Carter hired a third nanny and complied with the class requirement and attended the follow-up visit and remained, on the surface, within the boundaries of what the family services system required. She waited. The thing about waiting, she had learned in her first life, was that it was not passive. It was the most active thing she did because it required her to resist, every single day, the impulse to move prematurely. In her first life, she had always moved too early, called too soon, filed too quickly, put things on the record before the record had enough weight to hold them. She had been desperate then, and desperation creates its own pace. A pace that is governed by the unbearable quality of the present rather than the strategic requirements of the future. She had not been able to wait in that life. She had not had the luxury of knowing how things would develop if she did nothing, because she had not lived through the development. She had that knowledge now, and so she waited with a precision that looked, from the outside, like acceptance. Month 6 began with a Tuesday in late July. She knew, from her first life, that this was the month. Not from prophecy. She had no certainty that the second life would track the first with precision. But she knew Carter. She knew the pressure he was under, professionally, financially, in the relationship with Jasmine that had been deteriorating since the police call in month 5. She knew that people who operate under sustained pressure reveal their true operational threshold. Carter's threshold was lower than almost anyone who knew him understood, because he had spent his entire life structuring his environment to prevent pressure from ever reaching that threshold. He did not know what he looked like when it did, because he had never had to know. He had always had enough money, enough staff, enough social insulation to prevent it. He had the children now. He had a CPS investigation on his record with a substantiated finding. He had a girlfriend who was reconsidering the arrangement. He had a third nanny who had lasted 4 weeks and was visibly unhappy. He had a professional situation that Vivian knew, from the quiet financial intelligence she had been gathering since March, was under strain. His primary client portfolio had contracted, and the specific investment structure that had been generating the majority of his income was under review by a regulator whose interest in it had not been publicly disclosed yet. He had all of this at once, in the way that people who have always been insulated from convergence experience convergence, without the structural resilience to absorb it. On the Thursday of the second week of July, at 6:45 in the evening, Carter left the children in the apartment. Not with a nanny, not with a babysitter. The third nanny had given notice that morning, and Carter had not yet made arrangements. Both children were awake. Leo was in his high chair with the remnants of a dinner that had been assembled from whatever was accessible, and Mia was at the kitchen table with a coloring book. The television was on in the living room, a program selected for its capacity to hold a 3-year-old's attention, which told her later that Carter had been thinking about leaving for at least a few minutes before he did it. He went downstairs to meet Jasmine, who had apparently decided to end the relationship in person and had arrived at the building unannounced. The conversation in the lobby lasted, according to the building's entry log, 38 minutes. Mia, who was 3.5 and who had her mother's capacity for observation and her own particular variety of self-sufficiency, did not panic. She found her way to the kitchen. She was attempting to get Leo out of his high chair when she couldn't work the tray. Release, and Leo began to cry, and the neighbor in the adjacent unit, an older woman named Mrs. Pellegrini, who had, on several occasions during the preceding months, mentioned to the building management that she was concerned about the noise levels from the Langford apartment at late hours, heard the crying. Mrs. Pellegrini knocked on the door. When no adult answered, she called the building management. The building management called the front desk. The front desk paged Carter. Carter was still in the lobby. By the time he came upstairs, Ms. Pellegrini had been listening to Leo cry for 14 minutes and had called 911. The police arrived before Carter reached his own floor. Vivian was at her apartment when her phone rang. Not Carter. She had expected the call to come from the police or from family services. It came in the event from Diane. "It happened," Diane said. She was already standing. She had her keys in her hand before the sentence was finished. "The children?" "They're safe. Police are on the scene. Family services has been notified. This is going to trigger an emergency removal hearing. It's a third documented incident. There are officers documenting a child endangerment situation, and the existing substantiated finding from month 5 is already in the case file." She drove to the building. She was not allowed past the lobby immediately, which she had expected. She sat in a chair near the elevator bank and waited. The building was quiet in the way that buildings are quiet when something is happening on one of the upper floors that everyone can sense, but no one will directly acknowledge. The doorman kept his eyes at the desk. The front desk manager kept making small adjustments to the items on his counter. A woman in exercise clothes came in through the main entrance and then, reading the atmosphere, took the stairs instead of the elevator. She had a cup of coffee in a paper cup from the deli 3 doors down. She had bought it on the way in out, of habit, because she had been in transit when Diane called and the purchase had been automatic. The coffee was already cold. She drank it anyway and watched the elevator and did not look at her phone except once to confirm that Diane had filed the emergency notification she had asked her to file 2 weeks ago in the event that exactly this circumstance arose. She had prepared the filing 2 weeks ago. She had prepared it the way you prepare everything when you know the approximate shape of what's coming, even if you cannot predict the exact timing. Carter came down at 9:15, flanked by one of his attorneys. He looked at her across the lobby, and his face went through a sequence that lasted less than 3 seconds, and that she catalogued in its entirety. The reflex of accusation, the recognition that accusation was not operationally useful at this moment, the pivot to a controlled expression, and then, last, beneath all of it, the thing he would never have shown anyone if he had been performing at full capacity, a brief and terrible confusion. The confusion of someone who has run a strategy for long enough that he has stopped considering what losing that strategy would feel like. She held his gaze and said nothing. He looked away first, not dramatically, the way people look away from things they have decided not to engage with. His attorney touched his arm and said something in a low voice, and they moved toward the building's side entrance together. She watched them go, and then she turned back to the elevator and waited. A family services worker came down at 9:40 and told her that both children were being placed with her on an emergency basis pending the hearing. The worker's name was Ms. Carver, and she had the specific, calibrated affect of someone who has delivered this kind of news enough times to have found a tone that was neither warm nor cold, but simply present. She explained the process clearly and efficiently. She gave Vivian a paper with the hearing date. The emergency removal hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. At the hearing, Carter's attorneys argued for restoration of the primary arrangement pending a full review. The judge assigned to the hearing, a compact, unhurried woman named the Honorable P. Carrington, read through the case file with the particular silence of someone who has been on this bench long enough to understand the difference between a household in adjustment and a household that has produced a documented pattern of welfare concerns across 6 months. She asked Carter's lead attorney 3 questions, all of which pertain to childcare continuity and the current status of stable care arrangements in the primary household. The attorney answered the first 2 smoothly and stumbled on the third, which required him to explain the reasoning behind the dismissal of the third nanny in a context that also included the existing substantiated CPS finding. Judge Carrington did not restore the primary arrangement. She issued a temporary order granting Vivian primary physical placement pending the full custody review, with a hearing scheduled in 60 days for permanent modification. She recommended continued family services involvement in the review process. She recommended a guardian ad litem for the children to ensure the modification proceedings were conducted with the children's independent interests represented. She said, before closing the session, the court's primary interest is the welfare of these children. The arrangement before us today does not appear to have served that interest adequately. The gavel came down. Vivian sat in the courtroom for a moment after Carter's team filed out. Diane gathered her papers with the efficient movements of someone who had prepared well and executed accordingly. Outside the high windows of the courtroom, the city was doing what cities do in late July. Moving, indifferent, bright. She could hear the muffled sound of traffic through the glass. She could smell the particular combination of paper and old wood and climate-controlled air that courtrooms accumulate over decades of people sitting in them holding the outcomes of their lives in their hands. She thought, briefly and without sentimentality, about her first life. About the October night she had died on a borrowed apartment floor, alone, having understood too late that the way she had fought had been the problem. That fighting from emotion, from desperation, from the raw animal certainty that she was right, none of it had mattered. What had mattered, in the end and in this version, was structure, documentation, the quiet cultivation of a system that was already designed to intervene when children were at risk, and the patience to let it function the way it was designed to function rather than trying to force it. She had not forced anything. She had arranged conditions. She had made introductions and maintained records and waited for the people and institutions whose job it was to monitor child welfare to do their job. That was the whole of the strategy. It fit on a single page if you stripped away every emotional element, which was, she had decided in the hospital in March, precisely the point. In the 2 months between the emergency removal hearing and the permanent modification hearing, she rebuilt the routine with the precise, unhurried care of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how it needs to go. Mia's replacement rabbit was already in the apartment, laundered and present. Leo's crib had a mobile she had chosen during the 6-month period because she had been gathering recommendations and resources throughout the custody arrangement with the same methodical attention she gave to everything that mattered. Mia came back to her with the specific quality of a child who had been managing something she didn't have language for and was now, incrementally, putting it down. Not dramatically. It was not a film reunion with swelling accompaniment. It was Tuesday bedtime, and Mia wanted 4 books instead of 2, and Vivian said yes to 4 books, and then sat for an extra 12 minutes after the lights went out because Mia was holding her hand and not yet asleep. Leo came back smaller than she had expected, which was partly the distorted perception of someone who had been visiting rather than living with him, and partly genuine. She weighed him at the first pediatric appointment, and Dr. Anand noted that his growth percentile had dropped 6 points over the preceding 3 months. Dietary inconsistency documented in the chart with the clinical neutrality of a pediatrician who understood that the chart was also a record. She noted this in the same log she had been keeping since October. It would be part of the documentation for the permanent modification hearing. She did not think about Carter often during this period. When she did, it was without the anger that would have consumed the first life version of her. He had done what she had anticipated he would do. She had arranged the conditions under which what he would do would produce the outcomes she needed. There was nothing to be angry about in a sequence that had executed correctly. She did think about the children, specifically about the things they carried back from the 6 months that she could not log or document or file, the way Leo startled at loud sounds that would not have startled him before, the way Mia sometimes went quiet in the middle of a sentence, as if she had remembered something and decided against finishing. These were things she noted not for courts, but for herself, for the conversations they would have in the years ahead, in whatever age-appropriate language existed for what children absorb from the environments they're placed in. She had no illusions about any of it being simple or clean. She had made the calculation. She had weighed the harm of a 6-month period against the harm of a lifetime of inadequate primary placement and ongoing custody litigation that would drain both parents and the children alike. She had decided, and she would spend, she knew, a significant portion of the years ahead making certain that whatever Maya and Leo had absorbed from those 6 months was met with stability, with consistency, with the specific and unhurried presence of a parent who was paying attention. The permanent modification hearing produced the outcome the case file had built toward. The guardian ad litem's report, which detailed the children's observed attachment and adjustment in both households across the preceding 8 months, recommended primary placement with Vivian. The Family Services Review recommended the same, with continued monitoring and a structured parenting education requirement for Carter as a condition of his retained visitation rights. Judge Carrington, who had retained the case from the emergency hearing, granted primary legal and physical placement to Vivian. Carter retained visitation, scheduled, structured, with provisions for family services oversight in the first year. The financial settlement was a separate proceeding, and it was in that proceeding that the second part of what she had built in the preceding months fully engaged. Diane had spent the 7 months before the divorce filing and the subsequent 8 months of the custody proceedings building the financial case in parallel. The shell companies, the restructured accounts, the 2 years of quiet transfers that had been framed as portfolio management. She had hired a forensic accountant named Werner, who had spent 20 years in financial litigation and who regarded complex asset concealment with the specific enthusiasm of a man who considered it a puzzle rather than a crime, though he understood it was generally both. Werner had found things. Not everything. Carter's team had been thorough, and several of the transfers predated the period from which financial discovery could compel disclosure. But he had found enough. Enough to demonstrate a pattern. Enough to establish that the marital estate Carter had presented in the initial settlement discussions was materially smaller than the marital estate that had actually existed. Enough to provide the foundation for a motion to set aside the financial terms of the initial divorce decree on grounds of fraud upon the court. The motion was filed 6 weeks after the permanent modification hearing. Carter's attorney called Diane the following afternoon. "They want to settle," Diane told her without preamble. "What are they offering?" "The Calloway Street apartment, the investment accounts in their current form, a structured buyout of the shell entities over 18 months. She paused. "It's not everything. Werner's assessment is that there's additional exposure they haven't disclosed." "What's Carter's exposure on the fraud motion if we proceed?" "Significant. The concealment predates the divorce, filing by at least 2 years, which means it falls under marital fraud statutes. There's potential criminal referral territory if the forensic audit goes to a second phase." She thought about this. Not about the money. She had thought about the money in detail over several months and had a clear picture of what she needed and what she could accept, and what falling short of that minimum would mean for the financial architecture she was rebuilding. She was thinking about the shape of the proceeding, the specific cost of going further, the children's proximity to everything their father was doing or failing to do. They were 2 and 14 months respectively. They would not understand what was happening for years. By the time they could understand it, she wanted the legal landscape to be finished. She wanted it to be something she could describe to them, eventually, in terms that did not require ongoing litigation to give it meaning. "Counter," she said. "The Calloway Street apartment, the investment accounts in full original value with a forensic baseline going back 36 months, the shell entity buyout over 12 months, and a 10-year asset disclosure agreement. If he violates the disclosure agreement, the full fraud referral goes to the appropriate authorities automatically." Diane was writing. "The automatic referral clause is aggressive, which is why he'll comply with it." Another pause. She could hear Diane constructing the counteroffer in her mind, testing its architecture. "This goes back to them today. This goes back to them today." Carter accepted the counteroffer on a Friday afternoon, communicated through Prescott, who called Diane with the specific tone of a man who has spent the past several weeks discovering that he had miscalculated the level of preparation on the opposing side. The call lasted 4 minutes. Prescott said very little beyond confirmation of the terms. He did not offer an explanation. He did not ask for anything additional. The settlement was executed the following week. She read through the signed documents at the small desk in the reading room of her East Side apartment. Not the reading room on Calloway Street. Not the underlit space where she had made the first call to Diane almost 14 months ago. This room had better light. She had chosen the apartment partly for the light. She signed her name where indicated and gave the copy back to Diane's courier, and then sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. From the hallway, she could hear Mia explaining something at significant length and volume to Leo, who was not yet old enough to respond in full sentences, but who was, she had recently observed, already developing the capacity to appear to be listening while clearly engaged in some entirely separate internal process. The explanation appeared to involve the taxonomic distinction between different types of dinosaurs, a subject that had been occupying Mia for the past 3 weeks, with the single-minded intensity she applied to everything that interested her. Vivian listened to this for a moment, then she picked up her phone and dialed Werner's direct line. "The settlement's executed," she said when he answered. "Full terms?" "Full terms. I'll need you to begin baseline monitoring on the disclosed accounts. If there's a deviation in the first quarter, I want documentation before the disclosure agreement has time to be tested. I can have a monitoring structure in place by end of week." "Good." She looked out the window at the evening light coming across the buildings. "One more thing. The 2 entities he didn't disclose, the ones you flagged as probable but outside the current discovery scope." "Yes. Keep watching them. Not for the settlement, for my own records." Werner was quiet for a moment. She could hear the specific silence of someone who understood precisely what she was asking and why. "Understood," he said. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the desk. From the hallway, Mia had progressed from taxonomy to a detailed critique of the color accuracy in one of her dinosaur books, which she had apparently decided was presenting a stegosaurus in an entirely implausible shade of green. Leo had responded to this with a sound she had been categorizing for the past 2 weeks as his approximation of enthusiastic agreement. She heard their voices move down the hallway, the specific domestic sound of 2 children in motion, and then the particular thud of a small person settling onto a soft surface. She had one more call to make before dinner. She dialed Mrs. Hargreaves at the preschool. The director answered on the second ring. "Ms. Shen, I was going to call you tomorrow. Mia had a lovely day. She gave a very thorough presentation about Stegosaurus locomotion." "That sounds right," Vivian said. "I'm actually calling about enrollment. I'd like to increase Mia to the full 5-day schedule starting in September, and I want to enroll Leo in the toddler program." She paused. "I also want to update the authorized pickup list. Mr. Langford's visitation schedule is attached to the court order I'll send over. Outside of those dates, no one except me or my mother should be picking them up." Mrs. Hargreaves took a moment to write this down. "I'll update the file first thing tomorrow." "Thank you." Vivian looked at the settlement documents one more time, then turned them face down. "I'll have the court order to you by 9. She ended the call and went to make dinner.